Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 12th of February. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Trump's NATO comments spark fears of what a second presidential term may mean for America's allies.
Israel strikes Gaza's southern city of Rafah, where more than 1 million people are thought to be sheltering.
And another headache for Elon Musk. Ukrainian intelligence says Russian forces are increasingly using Starlink terminals on the front line.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
NATO says it expects the US to remain a strong and committed ally whoever wins the presidential election. The statement comes after Donald Trump suggested countries who don't pay their way are delinquent and shouldn't be protected. Here's what the leading candidate for the Republican presidential nomination told a campaign rally in South Carolina over the weekend.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay.
The revelation from the former president has renewed talk of what a second Trump term would mean for allies. As Bloomberg reported last week, the EU has quietly started preparing an impact assessment of the consequences of the US presidential election, with a particular focus on what a Trump victory would mean.
Responding to Trump, the NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said in a statement that any attack on the 31 military allies would be met with a united and forceful response. And Britain's Security Minister Tom Tugendhat says that while he expects the US to stand by its allies, other member states also need to meet their commitments.
I'm confident that the American people have consistently stood by allies in Europe when the time has needed it, and I hope very much that all of us will meet our 2% targets, just as the UK does, to make sure that we are bearing our share of the burden.
Tom Tugendhat referring there to the pledge by NATO members to spend at least 2% of their gross domestic product on defence and abide by the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all.
The Israeli military has conducted strikes on the city of Rafah in the southern Gaza Strip, where more than 1 million people have sought shelter from the fighting. The attacks come after President Biden urged his Israeli counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu not to take action without a credible and executable plan for the safety of civilians. The phone call between the two men comes after Netanyahu told ABC News that Israel is working on a plan to keep civilians in Gaza safe.
Well, Rafah is a very small percentage of Gaza, and I think it's about 10% or 15%.
I mean, the estimates
in the area north of Gaza that has already been cleared.
Well, there's an estimated 1.4 million people in that area right now. And if they can't just disappear, where are they supposed to go?
No, well, the areas that we've cleared north of Rafah are plenty of areas there, but we are working out a detailed plan to do so.
Benjamin Netanyahu there. The UK's Foreign Secretary David Cameron also weighed in on the risk of civilian casualties, saying he's deeply concerned about the prospect of an expanded Israeli military offensive targeting Rafah. Separately, Israel says it has rescued 2 hostages from captivity in an operation in Rafah. The Israelis were kidnapped in the October 7th attacks by Hamas militants. Authorities said both were in a good medical condition.
Ukraine says that Russia is using Elon Musk's Starlink services on the front line. The country's military intelligence services are citing intercepted conversations between Russian troops in the occupied Donetsk region of eastern Ukraine as evidence that use of the technology is becoming systematic. In response, Starlink said that it isn't active in Russia in a statement on Musk's X social media platform, but it highlights Kyiv's uneasy relationship with Elon Musk's internet service.
NatWest is planning to pay lower bonuses ahead of a possible retail share offer. According to Sky News reports, the lender is preparing to pay £17 million less in rewards than in 2023. The news comes as advisors, including Goldman Sachs, have been hired to explore a retail offering of the government's stake in the bank 16 years after RBS was bailed out in the global financial crisis. UK Government Investments, the Treasury-owned company that holds a 35% stake in the lender, says a retail offering could come as early as June.
And finally, the Kansas City Chiefs have won the Super Bowl, beating the San Francisco 49ers 25-22 in overtime. Star quarterback Patrick Mahomes threw the winning touchdown pass with 3 seconds left on the clock. The Chiefs, who also won the biggest prize in American football last year, have now won 3 Super Bowl titles in the past 5 years and established themselves as a dynasty. But the team's star tight end Travis Kelce says that they want more.
You can call it a dynasty. You can call it whatever you want. All I know is that we're coming back next year with our heart and the right mindset on trying to get another one. I can tell you that right now.
Travis Kelce there, who was joined on the field at the end of the game by his girlfriend Taylor Swift. So, yes, dynasty. I would normally say dynasty, but dynasty, of course, because of the NFL. Now, in a moment, we'll discuss how European leaders are reacting to those comments by the former President Donald Trump about defence spending. Huge attention and focus on this, the possibility of a second Trump term. But first, a bit more, though, on the sports headline that you need to know this morning. Yes, it was Taylor Swift. She won the Super Bowl.
Part of, I mean, it is a sort of a vaguely out of body experience watching the Super Bowl from this side of the Atlantic. And every year you see this like absolutely enormous, obviously a huge sporting event as well. But it's amazing what filters through, I suppose, is what I'm thinking about. And that, like the Taylor, every single picture is of Taylor Swift that's at the Super Bowl. If you're looking through headlines this morning, you would have thought that she was on the field playing. Well, it's that and the halftime and the halftime events and entertainment and the adverts. Of course, that's the thing that really translates into Europe. Isn't it? There's the prize guest for the halftime act. So Usher, we knew about. Alicia Keys and will.i.am were there as well. Of course, the advertising story is part of it as well.
Huge amounts of money spent.
We've been speaking to the CEO of Paramount, actually, Bob Bakish, about this, and even he was admitting that Taylor Swift has been part of the phenomenon that's drawn more audiences to the NFL, that she's been an incremental addition that's been able to bring people, and they're saying that it's going to be a high watermark for advertising spending for the Super Bowl as well.
Yeah, it's $7 million in terms of the 30-second ad spot for this year's game. So that's $233,000 per second. It's absolutely enormous amounts of money. But look, the reach is huge in the US. Almost everybody in America watches it, but actually it's those ads I think translate globally and can end up going viral.
Well, I mean, it was the who's who of celebrity world going through the ads as well. I mean, the likes, Ben Affleck, Jennifer Aniston, the Beckhams were in there as well. For now, Christopher Walken. I was watching a couple of them this morning. The Christopher Walken one is actually very funny because a lot of people doing impressions of Christopher Walken, which is one of the things that I think
you've become a legend when that happens.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a question of flattery there as well. But anyway, so even if you weren't watching what was happening on the pitch, there was plenty else to be entertained by the Super Bowl.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that was over the weekend. Let's turn our attention though to matters, well, significantly more serious. Donald Trump's comments also at the weekend in a rally in the United States that he once told a European leader that he would abandon NATO members to a Russian invasion if they hadn't met defence spending commitments. Now, this, of course, has renewed talk about what a second Trump term might mean for allies. And joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's EMEA News Director, Rosalind Matheson. Good morning, Ros. Look, first of all, let's just unpack and understand exactly what Trump was saying about NATO, because he was referring back to a conversation that he had had previously.
Well, that's right. In a way, he's referred to these comments a number of times over the years. He claims that back when he was president, in one of his many conversations with unnamed European leaders and officials, that he said to them if they didn't pick up their game in terms of NATO spending, their own defence commitments towards NATO, that, what would he allow Russia to do? He said, well, anything they want, really. And that's his version of those events. And there's been a semblance of that floating around in various reports for some years. The European officials and leaders that we've spoken to have a different view on that. They don't recall him saying that exactly. Obviously, they recall tense conversations over defence spending in general. Everyone can remember that Donald Trump threatened to pull out of NATO entirely. And certainly there were some tough moments about NATO spending and the overall idea of collective defence. But did he really say that he'd allow Vladimir Putin to come into Europe in whatever way he wanted? That's up for dispute. But obviously, the key thing here is, what does it tell tell us about what a second Donald Trump presidency might look like? Is this in the ether again because he's likely to be the Republican nominee for president?
The comments brought condemnation from Biden, from other European allies, but there are Republicans who support Donald Trump in these positions.
Well, that's right. It's interesting because if you look at, for example, the recent attack on US troops in Jordan, there were some Republicans who were calling immediately for the US to attack Iran directly. There were other Republicans saying, oh, don't do that because you're going to draw us into conflicts we don't want a part of. And that's probably the same for Europe. There are some Republicans who think the US has to stand up to Russia, the US has to stand up to China as well in Asia, for example, and has to sort of be there and present on the global stage, particularly pushing these other countries back. There are others who say it's not our business anymore. We can't be solving the world's problems for them and we can't be involved in these fights.
European leaders have been dealing with this sort of latest set of commentary, though, in a more robust way, although it still does seem quite extraordinary in the sense that it highlights the kind of fracturing, really, of what has been 75 years post-World War II of the sort of current status quo.
Well, it's interesting because, again, only a couple of years ago, the French President Emmanuel Macron called NATO brain dead. And then, obviously, in the aftermath of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, NATO's really come to the fore, both in terms of sort of supporting Ukraine against Russia, supplying it with weapons and training, and rallying, European nations and the US and other allies behind that. So arguably, NATO's been having a moment in the past few years. The question is, what's the future of NATO? And certainly, European countries are looking at the prospect of a second Donald Trump presidency. And does that mean at some point that they're on their own? And do they have to look to their own defence? And can they manage that on their own? And is there a future where NATO doesn't exist? And beyond, Ukraine and Russia itself, what does that mean, for example, for Turkey, which is also another key NATO state, but a pretty uneasy member of NATO at times?
How does this feed into the debate over funding for aid for Ukraine in the United States? We know that it's been extremely difficult to try and get any sort of bipartisan agreement there. And, the Trump position here is going to be key going into the election and beyond.
Well, that's right. It's coming at a very tense time, as you said, in Washington, over support for Ukraine, very bogged down trying to get aid packages through Congress, particularly military aid, as well as financial aid. And you can see the efforts by the US President Joe Biden to try and force that through, to really front load aid before it gets too far into the election cycle. But really a strong sense in the US at the moment of, are we just continuing to support Ukraine financially and militarily? And is that actually achieving anything? And what do we need to be doing from here? And you see those questions being raised also in Europe, I would add, but perhaps not quite as robustly. But certainly there's a sense that Ukraine, time is not on its side.
The EU and European countries who are part of NATO have been increasing military spending and sort of capabilities. Critics will say that sort of Trump's comments are dangerous in and of themselves, but supporters might argue, well, you do need to spend more for your own self-defence. How far away is Europe really from strategic autonomy, being able to sort of stand alone, as it were?
Well, these are certainly the words that Emmanuel Macron, again, likes to use. He talks a lot about strategic autonomy, Europe relying on itself for defence. And, there has been a pickup. We can see factories that were pretty idle now starting to produce ammunition again across different countries in Europe. But this is not a sector that turns on a dime. And obviously they've failed to gather enough ammunition to meet their commitments to Ukraine. You have large defence companies that saying we operate only on long-term contracts. We want some certainty here about what future warfare might look like before we commit to all these changes. And while defence spending has picked up, and certainly defence spending as a proportion for NATO has picked up, it's arguably decades away before Europe could say that it's truly self-reliant. Certainly, you just look at the large number of US troops on the ground across Europe at various bases, the amount of US equipment that's in Europe. And you have to say that Europe's probably some distance from self-autonomy on that front.
Another story that we're following today, Roz, of course, the latest developments in the Middle East as well with the Israel-Hamas war. What are the thoughts around what a Trump presidency could mean for the US role in the Middle East?
Well, if you look back again to Donald Trump and in his first presidency and his close friendship at the time with the Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu, certainly was a very strong advocate for him. But that seems to have cooled off a little bit. And, you know, Donald Trump again has been a bit reluctant to wade into the issue of the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza, like Ukraine. He seems to think that he could fix it in a matter of days if he came into power. Fundamentally, is he interested in the US being involved in foreign conflicts? No, he's not. And that's why he would sort of look, according to him, to end these various wars. Regardless of what the US is saying and doing, including under the current administration, Israel is determined to go its own way. That's very clear from Benjamin Netanyahu, again in recent days, despite the comments from the US, the UK and others, despite Joe Biden saying his war has gone over the top in Gaza. He says he's going to continue with his plans for a full ground assault on Rafah, which is near the border crossing with Egypt, where estimates of over 1 million people are gathered, and great concerns around their safety. So, in a way, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, the US-Israel relationship seems to have changed for good.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.